Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. In America, the colonial states signed on to a constitution to create a more perfect union. They're trying to do something like that here. The dream is a United States of Europe. But can it work? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Dominique Moïsi, Deputy Director of the French Institute for International Relations, and Edward Carr, Bureau Chief in Paris for The Economist. The topic before this House: can there be a United States of Europe? Until recently, Europe had been a divided and bloody continent. But since 1957, there have been moves toward unification, culminating in the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. That agreement calls for a single European currency called the euro, and ultimately for a federal European government. Economic unification will be difficult, particularly with most of the major nations of Europe fighting recession and high unemployment. And philosophical differences remain. England is leaning toward more of a free market approach with less regulation, privatized industries, and weakened unions. Countries like France and Italy seem to be moving only slowly to cut back the welfare state. Our setting for the discussion of European Union is most appropriate. This was the home of French Foreign Minister Talleyrand, who at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 helped create a peaceful interlude in 19th century Europe. After World War II, Talleyrand's home became the headquarters for the Marshall Plan, which helped shape a European peace in the second half of the 20th century. Today, it is a part of the American Embassy in the heart of Paris. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. And I wonder if we might begin, if you could try to put in an American perspective what this unification of Europe would look like, perhaps in terms of American history. We had a revolution in 1776. We had a very weak confederation for at least a dozen years. With several articles of confederation, and the weak system of states, and a strong system of states, the Constitutional Convention, and ultimately a union and a nation. Where is Europe in this process, if indeed it is a process?
I think there's an important difference, because Europe is a part of the world, unlike the US in the 19th century, that is grappling with the problems of relative decline, both economic and political decline. And I think that makes the entire process of the formation of a single political and economic entity much harder.
Well, I think the very comparison with the formation of the United States is part of the problem. From the early 50s, Jean Monnet, to the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that was what the Europeans had in mind, to create the United States of Europe. And with the return of geography and history that came after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we are in fact wondering whether we were not wrong, whether the very comparison was not the source of our problems. Maybe what we can try to achieve is the United Nations of Europe. But in fact, the very comparison with you is probably wrong. What we have here is diversities. I mean, if you simply drive from Paris to Den Haag, you will encounter 4 languages, 5 cultures. If you do the same in America, you will not even be between Boston and New York. It will be the same. And I think we are realizing how different we are, or impossible it is for us to simply abandon that very rich cultural inheritance, which is our past.
Is that a particularly French view, not shared, say, by the Germans? Aren't the Germans, for example, much more anxious to proceed with some sort of unification?
I think it's even more a British view, if I may say.
Well, it's
I
certainly,
agree.
It's certainly a British,
view.
but right.
But I think it's a view that it occurs at particular times. I mean, now we're in a phase of what they call politely in Brussels consolidation, i.e. things are pretty much stopped moving forwards and people are trying to shore up what's already been constructed. Why that is, maybe because of the recession in continental Europe, I don't know. But that's exactly what's going on now. Now, one can imagine in another 5 or 10 years, people starting to change mentality again. And if you'd been here in 1988 and we'd been talking, I think that answer wouldn't have been the first answer that you'd have given. It'd be much more, there are differences, of course, we want to preserve those differences, but whilst doing so, we can still construct something that is a political and economic unity.
You said Europe is in, it's difficult for them to unite because they are in relative decline. This is a very prosperous area of the world. I mean, you are talking about a potential entity of 600 million people, something like that, twice as big as the United States. Now, the United States is said to be the sole superpower, all that. So it is, and I'm big into demography and big into the numbers game, but 600 million people, even with low fertility rates, is nothing to be sneezed at. This is not a insignificant dollop of humanity.
Yes, but you're talking about the end point of the process. If that process ever gets that far. I mean, the point at the moment where we are is of Europe, as you say, whose stock is big, i.e. has a lot of wealth, it has at the moment high GDP per capita compared to the rest of the world, but whose growth is small. And it's clear that the other parts of the world, the US included, are growing faster and have greater influence. And it's grappling with that. I mean, Europe, part of the construction of Europe is to grapple with exactly that problem.
And the meaning of power. I mean, in a way, America is the only country in the world which has all the currencies of power, from military power to economic power to cultural power. Europe has only part of that. I mean, when Europe speaks on trade, it's, let's say, Leon Britton facing Mike Cantor. Europe exists because it's not only a market, it is an actor. When Europe tries to speak on foreign policy, you have 15 foreign ministers and no foreign policy whatsoever. So Europeans, in fact, the war in the former Yugoslavia was very much a sign of weakness for the Europeans. When we look at each other and we say, my God, I mean, we had to wait for the Americans for the situation to move.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think Europe was created with three things in mind: peace, prosperity, and power. And if one looks at its record so far, I think it has a good record on peace. There hasn't been a war in Europe for 50 years. Prosperity, its record's patchy. I personally think that the single market has done a lot to increase prosperity in Europe.
The common market.
Yes, that's the idea of free trade between European states.
And that really has come into being.
I think it's coming to being more than most people expected. There are still abuses, still cases where the market doesn't work as well as it should. But it's in the last of these areas, i.e. power, and that's Europe as a political entity, as an entity in foreign policy, as you were saying, as an entity that can coherently grapple with its problems. In that, I think there's been very little progress at all.
Yeah. But I think even on the two key words which you used, peace and prosperity, Europeans are more skeptical than they were. I mean, prosperity, what means prosperity with such high level of unemployment? And peace, what is the meaning of peace? If there has been war within Europe, amongst Europeans, and Europeans unable to stop that war, and having to call on the Americans.
I don't want to give a lecture to Europeans about the European politics, but I mean, to sort of blow away peace because there's a problem in Bosnia. I mean, in this building, they were Nazi internment cells. In the basement of this building, there are still cells there. I mean, this is a country in France that it was conquered, 3 times in less than a century by the Germans. I mean, the record, as you pointed out, Edward, in the last 50 years of bloodless Europe, of no real wars, is unbelievable. In the tendency of human history, this is a blood-soaked continent. And so what I am so astonished by when I come here is this pessimistic view. I mean, you have a continent at peace for a half a century, the first time in memory. You have a level of prosperity, if not necessarily a trend, but a level of prosperity unmatched in the world anywhere except in the United States. You have open borders, open trade borders. I mean, I would think that historically people, if they had a long view, would be saying, boy, we're really doing it. It's taken a while, but we're really doing it.
Don't our surroundings reveal exactly what's wrong with that, which is that Europe, the Europe of which you're talking about, it was constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries, both in terms of its philosophy, its ideas, its infrastructures, old by comparison with a lot of the rest of the world. I think it's hardly surprising that Europe's depressed right now. It's been going through a difficult recession for 5 or 6 years. These things always have a huge influence. No doubt when the economy picks up, there'll be more optimism again, and people will start saying, oh, we can start building Europe all over again.
How much is this recession, particularly the unemployment part of it, due not to normal cyclical economic tendencies, but to the strange employment policies of the welfare states in Europe? I mean, my understanding is it is so hard for a private firm to add a new hire because the social costs that go with it, with that commitment, the Social Security, the pensions, the health cares, the vacations, just add on another 50% or whatever it is, that this is a self-inflicted wound.
There are 2 or 3 countries in Europe that have managed to reduce their structural unemployment in recent years.
Great.
Britain is the obvious one because it was done through conflict.
The Netherlands?
The Netherlands and Ireland are the other 2.
Which you say Britain was done through conflict, what, Mrs. Thatcher and the unions? And,
yeah.
Right.
And at a very high social cost.
At a high social cost. Now, there's also been some reduction of structural unemployment in the Netherlands and Ireland, which has been done far more quietly, gradually, with more consensus. My fear, however, is that approach will not work in France, Italy, Spain, may not even work in Germany. And so it's as if the political process is unable, despite politicians' promises that unemployment is their priority, the political process is unable to deliver the reform that's required. It's hardly as if the economics is in question. I don't think economists disagree about what's required at all to get unemployment down.
Which is what? Why don't
Which is to help the labour market to work properly by deregulating, by removing all the devices like by moderating the devices like collective bargaining, job protection that keep unemployed people unemployed and give people employed a better deal.
Yeah, I think one part of in my country, France, for example, the present mood of pessimism is linked to a mixture with the economic crisis, which we discussed, but more with a crisis of the state. People don't believe in the state any longer to solve their problems. And since there is more state in France than in any other Western European democratic country, the crisis is more visible.
Now, let me ask the obvious question. We haven't quite gotten to it yet, but do each of you favor the further advance of European Union?
Oh, very much so. I think we need that, not to return to what we've known in the past. I think reconciliation between France and Germany should be a model for the rest of Europe and in a way for the rest of the world. And there is a combination in our minds of hope and fear, because nothing is a given. I mean, when I look at the extent of nationalism, the various divorce on identities. I mean, in a way, the Germans were dreaming of Europe in order to break away radically from their past. The French were dreaming of Europe in order to prolong their past of glory. And the British can't think of themselves as British within Europe. I mean, this is a potential for great tension, even tomorrow. And the only way to surmount, to transcend those diverse approaches is really European unification.
Yes, but I accept that, but there's the question is further integration. And one can equally argue, in fact it has been argued, that too much integration, too fast, does endanger the whole enterprise. One can imagine, for instance...
Is that your view?
Yes, I think it is. I think the project for a single currency in Europe is a good example of the risks of going too far, too fast. Supposing one includes many countries in the new currency, the euro, which are unable to cope with the demands that places on their economies. The danger is not that you have, as was intended, a big political structure leading forward towards a more united Europe. The danger is you have fantastic tensions within Europe. If you can't use your currency to adjust to economic shocks, and you can't use tax and spending to adjust to economic shocks, you rely on one thing: unemployment. There is no labour mobility in Europe. People stay within their own country. Even in Italy, people don't move from the south to the north in order to get jobs. But the danger is of a shock that hits, an economic shock that hits, say, Spain. Well, what does Spain do? The pesetas doesn't exist anymore. The government can't tax and spend as it likes because there are now limits on how much you can tax and spend, and they're quite tight.
The limits on taxing and spending would come from the euro capital of Brussels, but through the European Parliament?
They're agreed by all the countries who who form part of the new currency, and it means you have a limited budget deficit, and if you exceed that deficit, you're in danger of being fined.
So this is an enormous grant of sovereignty from the individual nations to the federation or the confederation. I mean, it's what our Congress sits around and does all day. They're saying, ship it off to Brussels.
Yeah, and what is dangerous is that there is a great imbalance between the progress of Europe on the euro and the political progress of Europe. So in a way, because the foreign and security policy does not progress, because the reform of Europe within itself in political institutional terms does not progress either. The only symbol of progress of Europe is money, the euro. And if it fails for some economic reasons, we are really in trouble, because the entire European project now rests on the euro. And there is a huge contrast between the expectation of public opinion, which is find a solution for unemployment, and the solution which the elites give, money. And money on the one hand, unemployment on the other. People don't see the link between the two.
It's very interesting, though, that usually currency unions have occurred after political union in history.
And not before.
This is an interesting case where they're trying to use a monetary union to drive the political process, which then goes on to coordinating, harmonizing tax policy, for instance.
But I would say I'm surprised that the key word, to my mind, of the future of Europe has not been even mentioned in the last 30 minutes, and that's the word enlargement. I mean, we are about to change the nature of Europe. If we are discussing the institutional reforms of Europe, it is because we know that tomorrow, instead of being 15, will be 20 or 25. And in a way, this is the true challenge of Europe. In 10 years from now, Europe will be a totally different animal. It will be an animal that will encompass from Spain to Poland,
You forgot about Edward's country. I mean,
well, England.
It's not clear that England will still be there.
England will be there. England will be there. England is a pragmatic country which we need and which will join fully at some point. But the challenge of enlargement is the key democratic challenge of Europe and the key institutional challenge of Europe. I mean, suddenly we'll be many more as Europeans within the European Union.
Sorry to be relentlessly pessimistic, but that's precisely why I think the enlargement is going to be very, very difficult for Europe. You're taking on, let's say Poland's the largest of these countries, is about the same size as Spain in terms of population.
40 million.
You're adding those countries that do not have agricultural support, that do not have developed social security systems, that have lower wages per capita, that do not have work protection. And you're trying to put them together with countries that are trying to, and reluctantly adapting all those things that are at unrealistically high level. How does one go about putting these two very distinct, very different entities together? I mean, there's a lot of political will that it should happen, if only for the basic aim of Europe to ensure peace. In other words, to bind in these countries before Russia becomes powerful, in order to secure, a Europe and all these westernized countries. That's the reason. But the social policy and the economics that goes along with that is incredibly complicated, and I can't see how it's going to develop myself.
Let me ask you this. Let's just try to resolve this now. We've sort of presented two scenarios here. One is a pretty gloomy one. Everybody's talking about unemployment and how this can't work and there's no common culture and et cetera, et cetera. The other one, Dominique has struck here a very resounding Eurocentric chord of a purpose and a meaning for Europe that would resonate and would re-inspirit this blood-soaked land and lead to easier and greater national union, more influence, more strength. In those two alternative scenarios, is that good for America or bad for America? Or how does it affect America?
I think it's in America's interest to have a healthy, optimistic, prosperous Europe.
And no longer perhaps be the sole superpower?
Well, I think it'd be an awfully long time before Europe has the authority, even supposing that the political processes in Europe actually become coherent, so Europe can have a coherent foreign policy. It'll take a long time before Europe has the authority of the US.
If you had a Europe that is, in terms of per capita income, already roughly the same as the United States, give or take a few percent, and twice as numerous, population twice, why is that such a leap to say that they wouldn't be at least co-equal? I mean, it'd be harder and stickier to make a decision to send an aircraft carrier somewhere, but that's not what the world is about particularly. Wouldn't this be the major competitor to the United States?
Well, you have to look at a world that will be a multipolar world, because you're speaking of the relationship between Europe and America. But tomorrow there will be China, there might be the return of Russia, Japan, India, whatever. I think, and I would totally agree with you, that what America needs is a strong, healthy, confident Europe. You want to be number one, but you don't want to pay the price, you don't want to bear the cost of being number one alone. Of course, and it's a friend of mine who says as a joke, what I want is a strong Europe that follows America's lead. This is the essence of America's contradiction. You speak of partnership, and in fact you truly want partnership. But when it comes to terms, because there is a natural tendency to bureaucratic arrogance, you behave in terms of leadership. And we can't blame you, because our divisions, our contradictions are immense.
It is a wise person who wants his cake and wants to eat it too. And on that note, which may be the American position right now, let me thank you both for joining us here.
Please send your questions, comments, and suggestions to New River Media, 1150 17th Street, Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.